name is Miguel Myers. Welcome to my horror confessional, where every week I'll have a guest come on and talk about one classic horror movie that they haven't seen and why. We'll discuss the movie, the actors, and probably get off topic quite a bit. Once I believe they have properly atoned, I will absolve them of their horror movie sin. Today, we have Scott Adlerberg. Scott is the author of the novels Jack Waters, Graveyard Love, Jungle Horses, and Spiders and Flies. His short fiction has appeared in various anthologies, and he has contributed pieces to such places as Crime Reads, Mystery Tribune, Literary Hub, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Each summer, he hosts the Word for Word Real Talks film commentary series in Manhattan. He was born in New York City and lives in Brooklyn. Ghoulish Books has released his most recent novel, The Screaming Child, a mystery horror novel told by a grieving woman working on a book about an explorer who was murdered in a remote wilderness region, only to get caught up in a dangerous journey after hearing the distant screams from her own vanished child somewhere in the woods. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm so excited to have you on. Let's talk about the book that was recently released by Ghoulish Books, The Screaming Child. So, where did the idea for this book come from? Because it sounds really interesting.
It was actually many years ago. I had a dream. I used to write my dreams down more than I do now, but I've gotten a lot of great ideas, even if it's just an image or whatever, for writing from dreams. And there was a dream of this woman in a kind of barren, rocky valley, who hears a child screaming, and she knows it's her child. And, as it is in dreams, I sort of was the woman, but I was watching the woman, that kind of, you're the person, but you're not the person. And I woke up, I wrote it down, and I thought about it for years, literally for years. And this was before I was a parent. And I couldn't really figure out how to do it. And should it be in the real world or kind of more dreamlike world? And then many years later, I became a parent, and I figured out a way to do this. And I could relate really to I guess that's like a parent's worst fear. And it's a fear that's a common fear, but it's very relatable. And I remember reading once, I think it was Ramsey Campbell, great British horror writer, who said, he writes sometimes his best fiction from writing about his worst fear, which always isn't fun, but it's, you're going to have something compelling there, hopefully.
Yeah.
And I wanted to write it from the point of view of the mother. And I felt I could do that if I write it a certain way, write it about things I know as a parent, and I've observed my wife, my own mother. It's not that. So, and that's how it came. That's basically how it came. And it started out kind of as starts as a sort of missing child mystery, but it becomes more of a psychological horror story. So, and I wanted to really make it more about what she goes through than just a mystery with a solution. It's really not that kind of a story.
Right. And so, do you have a background in mystery writing, or is that sort of like your love is of mystery?
Yeah, I love crime fiction in general, and I've
Nice.
always also loved horror. So the books, stories, I've written, or you write what you like, often kind of across, some of a little bit more crime. This one is really as much horror as, and in terms of reading, I probably have read more crime fiction than horror fiction, but I've read a lot of horror fiction since I was a kid. And in terms of movies, I like all types of movies, but horror has always been one of my favorite
Yeah.
in terms of movies. Since I was a kid till now, it's never died. So,
Nice.
yeah.
So I would like to hear more about the Word for Word Real Talks film commentary series that you do in Manhattan. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Oh, sure. That's really fun. I've been doing it about 12 years, and it's changed form a little. It used to be in Bryant Park in Manhattan. They have films every Monday night. And they used to show mainly old classics. I think it was sponsored by HBO or something. And
I love it. I
now
love it
they have,
already.
yeah, now they have more recent films. But we used to do a talk in the evening. I did a talk for an hour about the movie that we're showing that night: Bonnie and Clyde, Goldfinger. It could be any number, anything. Over time, it's changed a little bit, and now it's really about we pick. I get to actually pretty much curate it. an author who wrote a book about movies or a movie, or sometimes I have friends of mine who actually are very knowledgeable about film, novelists. And we discussed, like this year, for instance, there was a really good book last year written about 2001. So we did a talk about 2000. So it's me and a guest,
Oh, okay.
2001. And tied into this, like this year, this past summer, it's about 9 weeks every Monday. And it's in the afternoon now, not in the evening. So it's really nice. People come out into the park with lunches. We have some regulars every Monday. We had one talk this week. There's a new book about specifically the Roger Corman, Vincent Price, Edgar Allan Poe series by an
Yes.
author named Chris Alexander. If I'll tell him I give him a little shout out. But he wrote a really good book. He lives in Toronto. I used to run Fangoria magazine actually. And so we discussed. I read his book. It's got a lot of great illustrations too, but it's a good, well written book. And we discussed all 8 films for an hour, and going on all sorts of tangents and stuff. And that was the hour to talk. But it's about films across the board. Preston Sturges comedies this year, Roger Corman horror. So it's great. I really enjoy it every year. I look forward to it every summer.
That sounds amazing. That sounds like so much fucking fun. That sounds great.
Yeah.
We actually just did on the show within the last month or so. I did The Mask of the Red Death with
Oh yeah, yeah.
Vincent Price from this movie, and also Poe. It's based off of Poe and Roger
Corman
Corman.
film, right?
Yeah. So
It's a beautiful film. So that's towards the end of the cycle, and it's a gorgeous looking movie. I mean, it's just a great movie.
it's great, but spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't seen it. I'll give you a couple seconds, but I enjoyed the movie, but I was underwhelmed by the actual look of the Red Death. It was literally just paint, spread on people's
I get
face.
that's true. Well, it's a low budget movie. I'd actually probably had a slightly larger budget than the other, but yeah, I can see what you're saying.
Yeah, but I think all the budget went into the set design and the
Yeah,
costumes and all that. But still, it's Vincent Price, still Roger Corman, still a really fun movie. But I was just a
yeah.
bit disappointed by that. And so, okay, so that sounds like so much fun. So, as far as like the setup for that, like, do you guys does the park provide or does the
Oh,
city
no, so right.
provide
No,
all
the
that?
park. It's in Bryant Park is it's beautiful now. I mean, back in the '70s, when I was growing, it was you go in there. It was like a needle park, kind
Yeah.
of situation. No, it's a sort of private place took it over, and they sort of run it with the city. But they have a space in the park called the Reading Room, and in the summer, spring, summer, they break out all these books. It's like a place you could sit all day and read books, newspapers, and they have a space too where they have all sorts of talk series, poetry, fiction, and this one is the film series, Real Talks. And it's in this area, and they have chairs set up, and it's a specific place in the park. Yeah, so it's not
Is
like just people sitting on the grass or something, but
is it indoors or outdoors?
it's outdoors. It's all
Yeah,
outdoors. So
that's
we've had a
man,
few
that sounds fun.
rainouts, but it's summertime. Remember,
Yeah.
we did one where we did in the heat of the night, and it really was like 100 degrees and very humid New York summer. This is perfect. We're all sitting here sweating like Rod Steiger and Sidney Poitier,
Yeah.
and
That sounds like so much fun. So I had the opportunity to watch The Return of the Living Dead at the French legation here in Austin, Texas. And if for people who don't know, if you don't know, the French legation is like one of the oldest settlements in Austin, and it was
okay.
used to be owned by the French government.
Mm.
And so there's this really nice house in these grounds. It also served as a graveyard. And
Oh,
so there
okay.
was some graves there, and we were watching Return of the Living Dead in this
Oh,
graveyard
that's great. That's
section.
fun.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I know like in LA, like there's I think in Hollywood Bowl or something like that, they do that where they show movies in the cemetery or something like that.
yeah.
But that's something I'm very really interested in. I know I was just talking to you before we started recording, Scott, about the Saturday night spookies that I host
Mm.
at Ghoulish bookstore in it's in Selma, Texas, but really just north of San Antonio. I just enjoy bringing movies to people who haven't necessarily like to audience that wouldn't necessarily see them
Yeah.
or just hadn't had a time to. That's kind of the reason why I started this podcast, right? Because I want to talk about these great older movies. What how does it feel like to you when you like people maybe come up to you afterwards or send you an email or something like that and say, I've never seen that movie, but like it was so great. Or, like what?
Oh no, it's great. Yeah, of course. And it's a mixed group. You have some very, very knowledgeable, people there. And then and it depends. Like sometimes if it's an older crowd and we're talking about newer movies, they may not have seen those movies, like more contemporary, or vice versa. But no, that's always exciting to like, you see sometimes you see people there taking down a few notes or coming up after what was the name of that movie? Because we talking fast, going getting a good conversation. Oh,
Yeah.
and that's of course that's all. That's fun. That's always Oh yeah, you got to see this. It's playing now on the Criterion Channel or Max, or you can stream it on Prime or whatever. Tell them where they can see it. It's really
Yeah.
that's exciting.
um, and then do you record your interviews?
We haven't done it. I mean, it's been many years. And so many people. I've got to figure out a way because the sound there is tough. Because you're
Because
in
you're outside, yeah.
you're outside. It's New York. Fire trucks go by. Things like that. But I got
Yeah.
to figure out a way to do it because it's really.
I
Several people have said that to me that we should do that. Yeah.
I gotta tell you, Scott, if you ever figure out a way to do it, I would be the first one to sign up. Like, because that sounds like
Okay.
right up my alley.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And to be like I've never been in New York City, so I don't know where it's situated. But like to be in New York
It's right
City,
in Midtown. It's on 42nd Street. Not where the movies used to be, but right
yeah.
behind the big public library with the two lions. So you're right in Midtown Manhattan, basically,
Okay.
right in the center of Manhattan.
So let me ask you a question. So it sounds like you're born and raised in New York. So do you have and I don't know how old you are, and we don't need to go there, but do you have any experience with the old Times Square with like the old like
Well, I don't mind. I'm
movie
61, so
houses?
I don't
Okay.
mind saying, yes, no, I absolutely remember. I lived in the city till I was about 6 with my parents. Then we moved a little north, like in the suburbs, but we were constantly coming into the city, relatives, friends. And I think I was talking about this with someone recently. My parents made a big effort to make sure I got into, because they worked in the city anyway, but got into the city a lot because a lot of kids outside the city don't. But I do remember the old 42nd Street that show, like you see like the beginning of Shaft, mentioned like
Yeah, yeah,
1972.
yeah.
It's like it's a different world completely. That opening scene when he's walking down 42nd. Yeah, I remember that. And I wasn't into them when I was 10, but the X-rated place in the movies and everything, but absolutely. It's so different now. It's really so different
Well, I
now.
just think of like Basket Case, like where
Basket Case is a great one.
yeah,
Yeah,
where
for
they
that.
show like scenes of like the old, when horror movies, when you see like these old scenes of like Times Square and you see like the old advertisements for like horror movies and all, and you're like, man, it looks so great.
I
As
know, I
somebody
know.
who has never experienced that, like I'm jealous of people who have, but I also know that a lot of people say that that was like a hellhole, like
It
at
was
that
kind of a
point in time.
combination of both, to be
Yeah,
honest. Yeah, that's true. It's not all nostalgia. Oh, it was so whatever. There were things that were not colorful about it and interesting. And the fact, the movie part was great, that's for sure. But overall, it's a mixed bag, I guess you could say. But a lot
yeah.
more colorful and interesting than it is now. That I think you could say with confidence.
And so before we get into your background, I do want to give you an opportunity to let everybody know how they could follow you, how they can, any social medias, any
Oh, yeah, I mean the
websites, all that
usual.
sort of stuff, how they can find you and support your work.
Yeah, I'm on Facebook, Twitter, or X, whatever it's called now, at Scott Adlerberg. Instagram is Scott Adlerberg, the usual places. I guess if you mention it, as far as the new book is concerned, I'm always happy when someone, picks up a copy. It's on Amazon, but if you feel like ordering from Max directly, Ghoulish Books, that's preferable. I'd rather give Max some money,
Yeah.
a share than Amazon, So, and Max, will say, I mean, I've known him for years. We never met, but he reached out to me many years ago when he had written a book. I think he'd read one of mine, and can I review it, which I did. And we just known each other that way for many years. And I sent him the Screaming Child, and he said he'd publish it, and he's done a terrific job. I mean, I'm not just saying it, but he's a really cool guy. Seems like he works his ass off. He's he's always worked, but he really has done a good job with this, and he seems to do that for all his authors. It really does seem that way.
Listen,
So
Scott, this is an anti-Max podcast, so we're not going to be having any
he's also a
positive.
bit flaky, and he gets
There
on
you
my
go. There you
nerves
go.
and stuff.
That's what I like to hear. All right, so let's go a bit into your background. So you were talking about growing up peripherally around the city. So what
Mm.
is your background with horror movies, horror literature? I know we talked about it a little bit earlier, but did you grow up liking it? Was it like a family thing, that sort of stuff?
I'm liking it. I'm trying to remember. My parents, I guess, I'm an only child. My parents like, horror to an, especially classic horror. My father in particular loved like the old, like probably I started with the old Universal, like a lot of when I was 7, 8 years old. And these are the days when all these movies in black and white, all horror, were all on TV. So I was just loved the old Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman. And my father and my both were big old movie fans, very detailed. They knew had a lot of knowledge. And then I just, even like to Japanese Godzilla movies. And then as I got older, I just continued liking to the point where newer, horror movies. So I've always been a very, very big horror fan. And then especially, I guess it was older, but whenever it started, the 80s, 90s, probably 90s, sort of the gray video market, when all the sort of Euro horror and Giallos, which I
Yeah.
knew little of, not a ton about, um, came to being. And then I started buying a lot of the quality, a lot of them is terrible, but video, VHSs, the old gray video market.
Yes.
And I bought a ton of them. Then things became on DVD and things were remastered with great quality, which is terrific. But it's funny, like you want to hear like a funny, believe like one of my favorite horror movies when I was 14, I went to see Carrie when it opened.
Nice.
And I don't know how many people consider like the person I went with, because she was like my main movie companion. And it was my mother, only child. She was a big, and she knew Brian De Palma. I think she'd seen Obsession, so she knew Brian De Palma before I did, which is like
Oh
your
yeah.
mother turned you up. We went, and I remember that to this day. And Sissy Spacek was new, so I
Yeah.
guess I knew Travolta because he was on like Welcome. Maybe he was on Welcome Back, Kotter by that point. But they were all pretty new, all those actors at that point.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I go to see Cat. I walked out of it literally like with my legs trembling from the final, that final. That's still one of the scariest shots I've ever seen. Totally unexpected. The
Yeah.
hand coming out of the grave. So yeah, it was just I've been a horror fan since I've been a child. And you could watch. I remember watching like one time there was a movie. They used to have these write-ups in the Time, New York Times, long list of stuff what's on for the week, and I used to look at it every Sunday. The Sunday, it's what's going to, and the movie Lamora, the Lady Dracula, or what's it called? A Child Fairy Tale. This very low budget horror film from
I
the
don't think I've heard of that one.
1973. Oh, it's a Southern Gothic, very very low but very creepy
Okay.
movie, and never had heard of it. And the New York Times, which is more or less like hybrid, gave it a great review, like this unsung gem. This is probably around the late 70s, and the movie had come out early 70s. 2 in the morning was on a Saturday. So it's one of those things like your parents are asleep, sneak downstairs to watch it. Dark, the house is dark, keep the volume on low. Anything to watch this movie because you can't tape it, it's not streaming, But you're dedicated, and there's a sound upstairs. Oh no, like they wake up. It just made it more scary, more
Yeah.
tense. But so that was my, back. So I've always been a big horror and reading too. I mean, I think I started with a lot of the real classic, Poe, M.R. James, like classic old. And then I started reading Stephen King when I was a teenager, and I've always liked horror fiction. So
And how do you feel like that informs what you're currently doing as far as like your writing or even like the movies that you choose to pick for the program?
yeah, when I can choose ones for the program, we had two horror themed ones this year. One was Poe one and another one. Um, but no, in terms of writing, I like all sorts of fiction, but I do like genre fiction. And I just find, telling a good horror story is it's challenging. It's fun. It's a very hard thing. There's a lot of horror written. It's very hard to scare people. And I think too, there's so many variations. You could write a graphic horror novel, a bloody one, more psychologically oriented. Um, so few of my books and number of short stories. I've written number with horror because I just find it's a compelling. It's a great way to explore psychology. Also, I mean, I happen to like fiction that has we really get into somebody's mind or the character's mind. You know, even a bit more than just action scenes. I mean, anything is good if it's well done. But horror is a great way to explore psychology, human psychology. And I think it's one of the best genres for that. Crime fiction is good for that too, but horror can be very, even if there are things supernatural, maybe they're a reflection of the person's psychology, the character's psychology. I find that endlessly fascinating. You know, going back to Poe, I mean, you're in someone's mind and you can't escape to fiction now, horror
Yeah.
fiction now. Yeah.
This is kind of a non sequitur, but have you ever heard of a movie from the late 70s, from 1977, called Death Game?
Death Game, is that with Harvey Keitel? Which
No,
one is
directed
that?
by just like a two-time director, Peter Traynor, starring Sandra
No,
Locke and Colleen Camp.
no.
Uh, it's it's about two women who show up at a guy's house and on a night, and it's a stormy night, right? And his wife has just left to out of state to go take care of the kids, whatever, and they like seduce him.
Oh, is this the one that what's his name remade recently?
Yes, it
Yeah,
was
yeah, yeah. And I know
remade
what you're. I
by
didn't see it, and now I
yeah.
know it.
So
Right,
I didn't realize that. So I'd never heard of Death Game, and I don't really. It was remade by Eli Roth, right?
right, right,
With Keanu Reeves. I haven't
right.
seen that movie. I don't really follow Eli Roth too much, but so yesterday I was watching. I just popped open Shutter, and it was on there, and the
Mm.
poster looked amazing. So I was like, oh, I'm just gonna give it a shot. I was doing something. I was like, I'll just have it on the background, and it very quickly,
Took over your attention.
yeah, took it over. And so, but you were talking the late 70s, and I am a huge advocate of the 70s being the best decade for horror movies.
Yeah, it's a great.
Uh,
I agree. Yeah, it's a great decade. I
Season 2 of this podcast was called My 70s Confessional, and I had my friend
know.
Anthony Jerome come on, who co-hosted with me for 10 episodes, and I chose one movie a year from 70 to 79
Ah.
to kind of show him like the best that the decade had to offer.
Mm.
And by the end, he became a fan of the 70s. However, he does listen to the show, and I know that he has backslid a little bit. So, Anthony,
I think
I
that
hear
I think. Well, let me just the death thing. The Harvey Keitel one is a movie called Death Watch. I'm sorry, which is
Death
another.
Watch. Okay,
It's not a horror movie, but it's a good movie. But yeah, I think the '70s, like movies in general in the United States and around the world, you know, all of the taboos, so to speak, came off, and the people, the directors, the filmmakers, they could be much more adventurous. You know, around that time, censorship's pretty much faded away, and so you see the most outrageous. Right, I agree with you. The most outrageous and even high budget films, you know, from like The Exorcist or the Palmer film, even those kind of films, they were doing way more than it had ever been done. So you really had that sense of taboo busting, sort of daring, right? Sort of
yeah,
transgressive cinema in many
exactly.
ways in the '70s. Yeah, so I totally agree.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So, I'm gonna get off my old man's soapbox here for a
I
second.
know, but they're good. Good movies are good movies. So
Yeah,
whatever it was
exactly.
on. What's great too is now people can really access more stuff from the past than ever before. So that's a good thing. It's around
100%.
somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah. So today, Scott is here to confess his horror sin of never having
Yes.
watched
I don't-
The Last Man on Earth from 1964. Is that correct?
that is correct. I
Okay.
don't know how I've never seen it, but I never had seen it till this week. I watched
And,
it the first time.
and so that was going to be my question: is how did this particular movie pass you by? Was it just obviously you've heard of it, right? Because it's one of the most
Yeah,
famous
yeah.
ones, and you're a
Right.
writer and horror writer, but like it was just on the list and it never interested you, or what was happening there?
I don't. He said Vincent Price. Talk about going back in the past. Vincent Price is one of my favorite actors ever. Because
Even okay, all right,
and I don't say he's the greatest actor. He is. Vincent Price is unique. I mean, he is. You know, but he's one
yes,
of my favorite actors ever. Partly, again, that could partly be because I watched a lot of his movies, those AIP movies, as a kid. So he's, you know, it's like a sort of a nostalgic feeling.
right,
But I think his film still. He's such an entertaining actor, and when he's serious, when he's forced to be serious, like in Witchfinder General, which is a great film,
Amazing film.
he shows his real acting chops. Um, so somehow this film, even though it's from one of the most classic, iconic horror novellas, really, by Richard Matheson, I Am Legend. I sort of read lukewarm things about this, which I don't know why that's Tommy, because there's so many horror films that have got terrible, considered, this movie's trend. I raced to see them.
Yeah.
So I can't really explain why a movie that's from a very famous source with one of my favorite actors. I just never, maybe it was because it didn't get trashed and it never got super praised. That's the only thing I could think. It just seemed like, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I just never got around it. So that really is a surprise, because I've seen some Vincent Price movies that are, not very good. And this one, I just never, I just don't, that's the reason I did. It just sounded,
Yeah.
And so that's the only thing I can describe it to be honest. Yeah.
Scott, I have a very important question for you. Have you
Yes.
seen The Tingler?
Yeah. I've seen it.
So you saw The Tingler before you saw The Last Man.
I know, exactly. It's a good one.
Okay. We've actually done the episode of The Tingler before this one, and then I did the Mask of the Red Death. So if you want to hear more about me going into the magnificence that is Vincent Price, go back to those episodes.
No, I love it. Sure.
Yeah,
Okay.
you as well, but I was talking to the audience. I'm not like assigning you homework yet.
Oh, no. Okay.
But I did want to talk a bit about the person who you mentioned earlier, Richard Matheson. So let's get into talking about this movie. So this Last Man on Earth was directed by Ubaldo Ragona. So this was shot in Italy.
Right. In Rome, in Rome, I think.
In Rome, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of majority actually of Italian cast and crew. So when you hear the Italian names, that's what's happening. But this was directed by Ubaldo Ragona. He had done I was going to try to say it in Italian, but I'm just going to mess it up. So he's known for like A Virgin for a Bastard. And then also directed by Sidney Salkow, who did The Lone Wolf Keeps a Date from 1940. And then he also did 4 episodes of the Addams Family TV show, which is kind of cool. And then it was based off the novel I Am Legend, as you stated, written by Richard Matheson. The screenplay was also written by Richard Matheson. However, he was dissatisfied with the results of the movie and the way the movie was going forward, and therefore he took the credit as Logan Swanson, so he could still keep receiving residual income from the film.
I think I read he took the maiden name of his mother and father for that Logan Swanson. One is his mother's maiden name, and one is, I guess his father. Maybe it's a pen name, Richard. But he had two parents or grandparents. He took that's where he got that name from.
Yeah, because Logan Swanson is not a real person.
Right.
And then he went on to say, I was disappointed in the film, even though they more or less followed my story. I think Vincent Price, whom I love in every one of his pictures that I wrote, was miscast. I also felt the direction was kind of poor. I just didn't care for it. And so my question to you was, obviously we're going to go into it, but how do you feel, because you've read the book, how do you feel Vincent Price was? Do you feel he was perfectly cast, or he was okay for this? Or do you agree with Richard Matheson that he was miscast?
I have to say, having seen it recently, I mean, I'd read that before, and now finally having said, I do pretty much agree with that. To start with, Vincent Price in this is fairly restrained. This is not one of his which are very entertaining, Theater of Blood or The Tingler. He's hilarious in The Tingler. But this is one of his, he is more restrained, so he's doing like more serious type acting. But there's something about him here that just it's a very physical role. The character, I mean, he has to do a lot of stuff that's very physical. He's fighting off these vampire type creatures. Yeah. He's running around the city, and he's got to, take dead bodies and throw them over pits. And the one thing that Vincent Price is not convincing particularly in is a very physical type role, I think. the second version of this story, although it doesn't follow the novella, the book very closely, was the Omega Man. And say what you will about that, Charlton Heston is great at those kind of physical. I actually realized he spends like half the movie with his shirt off, but he was clearly in good shape still.
Yeah.
Going back to his Ben Hur days, the guy. And then the I Am Legend version with what's his name with
Will Smith.
Will Smith is also. I mean, there's a scene where he's doing pull-ups or something, and he clearly worked out for this, or maybe he did it right after Ali. But the thing is, Vincent Price doesn't really have the quality of someone who's tough physically and stuff. He's a big guy, but that's one thing. And sort of what he was saying also is, I think the few times he gets attacked by the vamp, they're not even that threatening. He kind of like pushes them off. So I think that's what it just doesn't have the sense of tension because it does follow the story, the book pretty closely. There are a few slight changes here, but the general drift is very similar. Vincent Price just always has that sort of quality of being kind of cultured, which would be fine, but he needs to be a little rougher and gruffer. And he's not here. Like he was used beautifully in Witchfinder General. He was forced to by Michael Reeves, the director. They have these massive fights, but that sort of quality of a cultured person who's corrupted came through beautifully in that. Here, he just seems like someone who's even his voice just doesn't seem to carry what that character should sound like to me.
Well, and it's funny, like one of the first notes that I had for this movie was it looks so wrong to see like a disheveled Vincent Price.
That's true. He's always like sort of that sort of quality. He's cultured. He could be decadent, like in all the Poe films. It's something creepy or perverse in a fun way, almost always with him. Yeah. Creepy or perverse, but right. He never looks disheveled. And the only time he has that look really was in Witchfinder General, but it took a lot of effort to take that quality and reverse it. But that's a totally different thing than what happens.
Yeah.
What happens here,
Okay, so then it was also the screenplay was co-written by William F. Leicester, who was also a TV guy. The director was a kind of like half and half TV and movie guy. I'm talking about Sidney Salkow. But I wanted to talk about Richard Matheson real quick. So horror lovers recognize the name, but if for some reason you don't, here's some info. Richard Matheson was born 1926 to 2013, was an American author and screenwriter, primarily in the fantasy, horror, and science fiction genres. He's best known as the author of I Am Legend, his 1954 novel that was adapted for the screen 3 times. And then he was the co-writer of the first film. The other 2 adaptations, like you were saying, were The Omega Man, starring Charlton Heston, and then I Am Legend with Will Smith. He also wrote 16 episodes of The Twilight Zone, including Nightmare 20,000 Feet, which I believe was starring Shatner, right?
That's William Shatner. Yeah, exactly.
And then also the episode Steel, as well as several adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe stories for Roger Corman and AIP, like you were talking about. He did House of Usher, The Pit and the Pendulum, Tales of Terror, and The Raven. He adapted his 1971 short story Duel as a screenplay, which was directed by Steven Spielberg for the television film of the same name that year. In addition to I Am Legend and Duel, 9 more of his novels and short stories have been adapted as motion pictures. The Shrinking Man, which was filmed as The Incredible Shrinking Man. Hell House was filmed as The Legend of Hill House. What Dreams May Come. Bid Time Return, which is filmed as Somewhere in Time. A Stir of Echoes. Steel was filmed as Real Steel. And then Button was filmed as The Box. He also did the movie Cold Sweat, was based on his novel Ride the Nightmare, and Les Saints de Glace was based on his novel Someone is Bleeding. And so both Steel and Button had also previously been episodes of The Twilight Zone. And then also a short story of his was used in one of the segments of the TV anthology classic Trilogy of Terror.
Right. Oh, yeah.
So Stephen King has listed Matheson as a creative influence, and his novels Cell from 2006 and Elevation from 2018 are dedicated to Matheson. Filmmaker George Romero has also frequently acknowledged Matheson as an inspiration and listed The Last Man on Earth as the inspiration for the zombie ghouls that he envisioned in Night of the Living Dead. Going on to tell the BBC in 2005, "Well, they always say I stole the idea for Richard Matheson's novel, I Am Legend. That was vampires, so to try to disguise my theft, I went with flesh eaters." He was also inspired by its nighttime scenes of mindless ghouls laying siege to Morgan's boarded up house to its stark black and white look. Wow. So I think that Night of the Living Dead is unquestionably the better film, but The Last Man on Earth still deserves the credit of going there first. And then
I think it does have it has a good atmosphere. I mean, I was thinking, they filmed however they did it. They filmed all these scenes in Rome. I mean, the book takes place in Los Angeles, but it could be any city. I guess Matheson maybe was living in LA at that, whatever. And that part of the movie I think is effective. And it's funny, of all the things, when I was watching it, maybe because it's Rome and the 60s, for a couple of minutes, it reminded me of all things, totally different kind of film of like a Michelangelo Antonioni, art film from the 60s. You get like this Rome, it's totally barren. You could see, Marcello Mastroianni, because those they're wandering around and they don't know what to do. They're all upper middle class. This kind of has that feeling. And he sort of says in the beginning, "What, I have to get through another day." That part of the movie was very effective. It really, because it's always eerie to see a huge city that's empty. And it's not CGI. So it really has that feeling of reality of like, how did they do this? And it does look kind of strange. That part was very good. And I think one thing watching this, and I watched the other two adaptations recently, post-COVID, it has a kind of resonance too. I mean, it now, this movie you could add to the list of movies. Like, what did you watch during everyone at the beginning of COVID was watching every plague movie. I watched Contagion again, all this kind of stuff. 28 Days Later and everything. This isn't as strong as those movies, but it definitely has that feeling of, because that's what it was like a little bit. Without zombies wandering around, the cities are empty. There's nobody out on the streets. Those early days of COVID, 2019 or 2020, I guess, whatever, 2020. So post-COVID, this has a little extra kick. I thought, in the terms of somebody isolation. And there's nobody to talk to, and you walk out on the streets and it's empty, and it's a different world that suddenly. So it has that part worked quite well, and it actually is better now. It maybe post COVID has a little extra zing to it for that.
Well, at one point they're talking about an airborne virus and like how it came over and all, and I'm currently seeing. I was telling you before we started recording. I was currently seeing this and preparing for this movie with a wife who has COVID. So this is like close to home right now, But yeah, I 100% agree. This was a great. Either it could be both. It could be a great movie to watch during a pandemic, or completely stay away from it because it's going to.
Right, depends how you react. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, another thing was Anne Rice stated that Matheson's short story, A Dress of White Silk, was an early influence on her interests in vampires and fantasy fiction. So Richard Matheson, I just wanted to put it, he is so important when it comes to the history of literature in general, but specifically horror. Like, he is an influence on all your favorite content creators, your writers.
And he did such different types of horror too. Like the Hell House is a haunted house story. Mm-hmm. This one, vampire, zombie, and should point out, like, I Am Legend is one of his story is one of the first stories where it sort of takes a scientific approach to vampirism, to what the supernatural. That's one of the main tensions in the book. Is he's trying to figure out why they're afraid of garlic, and they can't go through water, and they don't look in mirrors. Classic vampire stuff. But they're not vampires like Dracula. So they fell victim to this sort of plague or whatever. And he's like, why are they like that when this has nothing to do with ancient superstitions about vampires? And he tries to find that scientifically. So that's another very key point about his contribution with this story, is he sort of took this sort of not science fiction, but science approach to why are these vampires like that? And why are they behaving like something out of a Bram Stoker novel when this is real life, and there has to be a rational explanation even for them. that was something he really brought in. He was a real innovator, in horror, in that way, in horror, from many of the things he did.
Yeah, and
Um,
it's always great when I'm watching a movie or TV show or something, and I'm like, and it comes up like Richard Matheson. I'm like, oh, fucking course, because he's
yeah, I know he
everywhere.
did
He's
so
so
much stuff.
ubiquitous.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned, like Trilogy of Terror, he did a few classic set or wrote the scripts. There were a few of those classic, several of those classic 70 Burnt Offerings. I think he did.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because he worked with Dan Curtis for which was Trilogy of Terror,
Yeah.
when Dan Curtis was making those made for TV and these horror movies. Yeah, and he pops. You're right. He pops up. He pops up. And Duel is that's one of the best TV movies ever. It was
Back
Spielberg, obviously, but
back when the networks were actually putting money into their movies of the week. Like, I don't
right.
know if people real or like younger kids don't remember, like, and I'm it was kind of phasing out by the time I was growing up, but like
Yeah,
movie of the week, these CBS and NBC and ABC, they would have
yeah.
these movies of the week, and they would pour millions of dollars into these movies, and they were big time productions. And like before cable, millions of people would watch these movies weekly. So like Duel was
Right.
one of them. I don't know if you remember like Dark Night of the Scarecrow. If you ever watched that one, that's
Yeah,
another
I remember those things.
those.
Right.
And you see it now, and you're like, oh, this was definitely a production, like a big production. Like, no, that was
We,
made for TV. And
yeah,
now you hear made for TV, you're like, oh, that's crap.
that's gonna be crappy. Right. No,
Different era,
totally.
different
I
era.
know. Definitely a different era. But
Okay,
so he's one of the iconic horror, writers, and he really is. There's no question about that. Highly influential. I mean,
right.
he's still adapting stuff like The Box was some years ago now, but that was written decades ago, and they did their own thing with it. But that was again, he's still relevant in the sense of people like to adapt his stories, play around with his stories.
Yeah, 100%. So real quick, the cast: Vincent Price as Dr. Robert Morgan. Obviously, we know him from The House on Haunted Hill, 13 Ghosts, The Tingler, Let's Kill Uncle, and also Thriller, which is like
Yes,
my
of
first,
course.
growing up, that was the first time I ever
Yeah,
realized,
I'm
or
sure for a lot of
and I
people.
didn't know
Yeah,
who he was at the time, right? But yeah, Thriller, and he actually does the laugh a little bit later, which is kind of crazy. A little small version of the laugh.
just a little bit, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And then we have Franca Betoya as Ruth Collins, Emma Daniele as Virginia Morgan, Giacomo Rossi Stewart as Ben Cortman, Umberto Rajo as Dr. Mercer. He was actually so I was looking up the credits. This was the one actor that I could find credits on that we would know, like an American audience or a Western audience would know. He, he was in Double Team with Van Damme and Rodman. I don't know if you
Oh
remember
God,
that.
was he really? I
Yeah.
saw that. Yeah, yeah,
He was in The Messenger with Fred Williamson, which is a blaxploitation movie from the 70s. And then he was in Mario Bava's Bear in Blood and Argento's The Cat o' Nine Tails. So he had a pretty good
That's a
oeuvre.
pretty. I think Giacomo Stewart Rossi is another because that's who it was, right? Because his face looks familiar, but with the makeup, because he was in a bunch of. I think he's in Kill Baby Kill. He
Yes,
was
he
in some
was.
of those Giallo and Bava films, Italian horror films. So yeah, well, that's another thing. Like when you watch, since this was Italian made, and if you like Italian horror films, Giallos, these faces pop up, and they were often they were dubbed and stuff, so you get these different voices. There's Giacomo Stewart voice with that voice. There he is with that voice, but the faces are familiar.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to give a really brief synopsis of the movie, and then we can go and get and talk about it.
Okay.
So, when a plague devastated life on Earth, the population died or became sort of zombie like, but not really zombies. We'll find out that very quickly that they're actually vampires living in the dark. Dr. Robert Morgan is the unique, healthy survivor on the planet, having a routine life for his own survival. He kills the night creatures along the day and maintains the safety of his house to be protected during the night. He misses his beloved wife and daughter, who were consumed by the outbreak, and he fights against his loneliness to maintain his sanity. One day, Morgan finds Ruth Collins, who he quickly finds is contaminated. He uses his blood to heal her, and he becomes the last hope on Earth to help the other contaminated survivors. But the order of this new society is having different ideas. That was the brief synopsis of The Last Man on Earth. So let's get into it. I have a couple notes, and then if you want to just go back and forth, or if you have notes or not.
Okay. You're thinking about what you're saying though, if just so I can, start off. One of the things that, because now that we were talking about Matheson, one of the things I think that where it doesn't work as well as it should, because of the casting of Vincent Price, he's, what surprised me in the book is it's bleak. That's not unexpected, but he really gets into, even though it was written in the 50s, he really gets into the Robert Neville. That's the character in the movie. He's called Robert Morgan. His sexual frustration. He does it in a very straightforward way without using straightforward language, but it's very naturalistic in that way. He's been living years by himself, and the vampires, some of them are women, and they do literally try to seduce him, and they sound like they're grotesque. It's not some buxom hammer vampire woman, type of thing, but it makes complete sense that a person, in this case he's male, that would be something that would be a problem, would be an issue that would be on his mind. He's years and years of for involuntary chastity. It's not the only thing that bothers him, but it's among many things. So it's very naturalistic in that way. Vincent Price is great, and as great as he is, all the qualities that he has. In no movie is he real that I know of. I've seen a lot of his movies, and I'm sure you have. He never projects sexual desire. He's good in the Poe films where a Poe character, he remembers his dead wife, or she's dead but preserved, and this romantic yearning in his semi-hammy way. He's great at that. But genuine sexual frustration and passion with a straight face, he's not. Even the flashbacks here, they do in all of these versions of the movie, the adaptations, they show flashbacks, as the book has, of what life was like with his wife.
Yeah.
And the book conveys quite well his memories of his wife, the feeling, the sadness, some of the physical yearning you remember. Vincent Price that's really not his forte. He's always a little detached. That's my impression of it. He's always a little bit detached.
I got to tell you, I don't know, but something about that wig in Witchfinder General, it does something for me.
No, that's a different. That's maybe that's why it's a great. Michael Reeves somehow got that. He wrote that out of
because that wig was beautiful.
Yeah, that's one where it's different. He really got a performance out of it like nobody else did.
Yeah,
but he sent him past his comfort zone. There's no question. But that's maybe one reason that it doesn't quite, because the character in the story he's really despairing but continuing on, which is how probably a sane person would react in that situation.
Right.
And Vincent Price, I always get the sense a little bit that life obviously could be better if he had some companionship. And then he runs into the dog, and in the story, to explain it, a dog appears in the story. He's shocked to find a living dog, who's kind of a mutt. Sounds very ugly. How excited would a person be if they haven't had any living companionship for years and they find a dog? They'd be thrilled. And he does show that he's happy and stuff, but he doesn't quite have he always has a little reserve, restraint, detachment.
Yeah.
That might be one of the problems here.
Okay.
It doesn't sink the movie or anything, but it doesn't have the emotional weight that it probably should quite, I think.
Yeah, that loneliness that it must feel like to be the last, who he believes to be the last man on earth, which he is or isn't, is up to debate, and we could talk about that later. But that loneliness must feel really, really jarring. And I believe it's been 3 years since the world ended. So I recently watched Old Boy again. Old Boy from 2003. And have you seen that one? I don't want to spoil.
Oh, yeah. That's a great movie, of course.
So, directed by Park Chan-wook. Spoiler alerts. Give me the next 10, 15 seconds, whatever. But in that movie, obviously, he is kidnapped and then held isolated for 15 years. And then when he finally breaks out, which is really cool how he does it, and he sees somebody the first time after 15 years, he just wants to touch them and be held by them.
Right.
It's you, the actor, I forget his name, Choi Min-sik.
Choi Min-sik, he was fantastic. I know.
Did an amazing job, just
showcasing
that. Yeah, portraying that. I don't think Vincent Price did that here, but it's also like I don't think the movie would have allowed him to do it. It's not what they were going for. So,
Yeah, that's
you know,
true. That's
uh, but so the movie opens up. It's an empty city, showing streets are empty, empty office buildings, stuff like that. Very reminiscent of the opening to 28 Days Later.
Mm-mm.
Was it by Danny Boyle, right? Yeah, Danny Boyle.
Yeah,
So
Danny Brown. Mm.
but then so we start seeing these dead bodies littered all over the place. And then we see a sign on a church that says the end has come. And I was actually just a bit jealous because that sounds really cool for the end to come. And then we see our guy, Vincent Price, pretty simple, pretty effective opening, but he just says, another day, better get started. And then the music kicks in, and then the credits start and all that sort of stuff. I was like, oh, that's pretty, because we don't see any credits or anything in the beginning of the movie. It's just the movie
Mm.
starting very quickly.
Right,
So I
which
thought
was
that was kind of
unusual, more unusual in those days.
exactly,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Because a lot of the time in those days and before that, you'd get all the credits up front, and then the movie would just
right,
end. You know,
right.
so I thought it was kind of simple but effective opening, which I liked. So this is where we see the Vincent Price looking disheveled. Find out that it's been 3 years since the world ended. Um, and then I wanted to ask you, well, I was going to ask you at what point did you realize it was a vampire story, but you read the books first, right?
No,
So
right,
you
yeah.
because I'm always interested. So some people, or I went into a movie recently, well, within the last year or so, and I won't say the name of it because I was surprised. They didn't give it
Mm.
away that it was a vampire movie until about halfway through,
Oh, okay,
and
yeah.
I didn't see any trailers or anything like that. I tried to avoid that.
Mm.
And so when I found out it was a vampire movie, I was like, "Holy shit, that's amazing that they were able to hold it this long." You know.
Yeah,
Also,
that's cool. Yeah.
I'm not the type of person. I have writer friends, and when they're watching movies, they're like, "Oh," because they're writers. They're like, "What would I do if I was writing this?" And so
Right.
they're really good at anticipating where the story is going to go.
Mm.
And I don't actively do that. Sometimes I do that because maybe the movie is telegraphing it to you, sort of thing.
Yeah.
But in general, I try not to do that. So
I'm more like you. Yeah. I like to let the movie take me where, I mean, sometimes if it's obvious, then of course you can't, but I like to let the movie take me where it's going to take me. I like to be surprised. I mean, I
yeah,
love that, of course. That's a
yeah.
pleasure. Yeah.
So then we see him kind of like going about his day. He's checking the garlic on his door. That's where, like, if I didn't know it was a vampire movie, I'd be like, that's something's weird about that.
Mm.
Um, there's a generator that he's like checking the oil on and gassing up, and he spends a good 2-3 minutes on this generator. And I was like, my note was like, this generator is gonna come back. Like, there's gonna be
Mm.
some plot point, like he's going to run out of gas halfway through the night, and they're gonna, he's not gonna have any electricity, and they're gonna be able to make their way in. Never see, never see the
Yeah.
generator again. But and then we also get his narration, which is great.
Generation is good. Yeah.
Always great to hear more Vincent Price. Now, I was going to ask you a question. So, I don't remember the source of this, but I remember someone, perhaps a famous author or director, saying that the use of narration in movies was lazy because you should be
Right.
able
Right.
to show what you're trying to say in this
Tell a
movie.
story. Tell a story visually. Right.
Yeah. So I was
Yeah. No,
wondering what you
I've heard
thought of
that.
that.
Well, all anything works if it anything goes if it works. I
That's
mean,
true.
it is a movie, it's cinema, it's film, and I do think generally speaking, the most powerful movies are the ones that tell a story. Like if you think of Brian De Palma or Dario Argento, just like for horror kind of directors, genre, they or Cronenberg. You watch one of his movies, you could see a movie of Cronenberg's 20 years ago, images, and not see it for 20 images stay in your mind because it's so good. I think it's so powerful visually.
Yeah.
I think generally speaking, that for sure is the most powerful way. But in this case, Let's say, let's use like, I think to compare like all three versions of the adaptations here. In this one, they have the narrator. In the Omega Man, there's no narrator, but the way they got around that was Charlton Heston goes around sort of making quips everywhere, which he's talking to himself a lot, which Vincent Price does. I think anyone who's alone would, he's not talking to himself like he's insane. He just he's no one to talk to. But that's how they sort of get around the sort of narrator problem. But I didn't think it bothered me since he's obviously alone. And the movie is pretty good visually, especially in terms of evoking, this abandoned city, this empty city. So that didn't really particularly, it does sometimes when it does seem lazy and they just get this exposition out and they don't want to show something visually, but it didn't particularly bother me here. And anyway, like you say, when is it not fun? Even, and he's not perfectly cast. When is it not fun to listen to Vincent Price's voice? Who's got a voice like that?
Yeah. It's great to hear.
So no, yeah, and he was serious too. Again, he was pretty restrained. He doesn't play this in his sort of winking at the audience, which is great, but he doesn't do that here. He's pretty serious.
There is a part later on in the movie, and when we get to that, I'll point it out, where he just kind of let loose a little bit, and at that point, it seems like he perhaps overacted a bit.
Yeah.
But we'll get to that one. So now he's going about his daily routine. And he gets on is it a ham radio or something like that?
Yeah, he gets on sort of like that. This is the international frequency or something. Exactly.
Yeah. But my question was like he doesn't seem to give people enough time to respond.
That's like no, you're right.
He's like breaker 1 2 or whatever the fuck he says, and then waits 2-3 seconds and then changes the channel. I'm like, dude, like imagine in your place, like if somebody were to reach out to you on the radio, you're in the other room, you're not like
I know you're not sitting there waiting for that time. 3 years later, right?
Yeah, you got to give them some time, but I guess that just goes to show that it's futile. But probably it's futile, but he continues to do it because humans are creatures of habit, sort of thing. You're gonna do it regardless of what. I don't think it's that deep, really. But
but that's a good point. I didn't even think of that when I saw it, but you're right. He really gave like no time for anybody to respond there. Yeah.
So then he's like still going about his day, and he's like, food used to be fun, and now it's just a source of kind of like energy for him. And he says at this point he just prefers coffee and orange juice. And I was like, you just hate your stomach lining? That's way too much acid. Like you don't have doctors, dude. You need to chill out a little bit.
I think what is effective here, though, some of those early parts are effective, where he's sort of driving around, and I think that works pretty well here. That just might be a very compelling sort of scenario because it works in all three movies, I thought, and it works in the book. And because I think, there's an element where I think everybody could be sort of like would fantasize, like if I was the only person, how much fun it would be to you go to any store, any supermarket, get whatever you want, take the best steaks, take the best wine.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to be up to a point. Now, 3 years of that obviously is too much, but that aspect of it's sort of like a fantasy everyone has. Just get rid of everyone. Can I just have a week where I can do anything I want in the world? I can go to the park and no one's going to be there. I can just do what I want. And this gets that pretty well when he's sort of driving around. And that always appealed to me like that. And it's even in the book a little, it could be fun, but if you really are the only person, then it's not fun. But there's that aspect of, that's sort of like a universal fantasy, just being, the world is yours for a while.
And I think that was represented very well by Romero and Dawn of the Dead. When they went to the mall, just that whole shopping.
Oh yeah, that was right. That was fantastic, right? Yeah, he played it for all it's worth there.
Yeah. So he does show. Then he's got like this grid system to search the city, and he kind of like blocks off and marks X when he's checked it out. But like at this point, for me, like there's no way I'd survive if I needed to do all this. Like at this point, what am I fighting for? What? He's a lot stronger than me because really, like,
you don't know. I know, right?
I'll just go lay somewhere and die.
Well, you say that, but you never. But I know what you mean. No, I know what you. But I think that's something that really maybe that's why Matheson, they sort of like got the gist of the story. They covered the basis of the plot. There's no question about that. The plot is very similar to the book. but they don't quite capture, even with the internal monologue, with his narration, this sort of, because in the book he does sort of have this sort of, I want to live. What the hell am I doing? Let me continue my routine. I need to get some more gas for the generator. This is ridiculous. I just want to kill myself. I mean, that he kind of goes back and forth, which I think is which is probably how you would react. I remember my wife. Let me think about her. Maybe I should go join her. She's dead and she's dead and buried. And that doesn't really come across that strongly here. That sort of, he must have some will to live, or he would have done what you said. He would have just put an end to it. But no one would be either totally gung ho and happy. And he just, it doesn't fully convey what his emotional sort of state is. That's maybe one thing that maybe Matheson felt was off here a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like that if we had shown him, we do see him a little bit frustrated towards the end of just like being alone.
Mm,
But I think showing his mental state a bit more would have given a bit more gravitas to the movie.
mm,
As it is right now, it's very surface level. They
yeah,
don't
yeah.
really dig too deep into what it would feel like to live in that world, because that's horrific. Like at one point, uh after the first night that we're there, he comes home and he has to put a record on because outside the vampires are so loud that he can't fall asleep. And then he
Mm,
just like or maybe it's the second night when after he falls asleep, but regardless, like that's terrifying that you can't really sleep because there's people like, so if you're not getting like resting sleep, you would be like exhausted, and so your
right,
mental
yeah.
state would be affected, let alone being the last person. So I feel like perhaps if we had just seen that a bit more, we would be able to connect with him. And I agree with what you're saying. He does feel a bit detached from us, like
Yeah, yeah.
where
Right.
we're like, we want to feel for this character, but it's like we're being held at arm's length a bit.
Mm,
Yeah.
right.
So
No, that's exactly how I feel. Even when he has a child and a wife. First his daughter gets sick, then his wife, and they show like he comes home and they're taking, I think it's one of them away, or right in front of him. So the military is kind of taking people, sort of like martial law, and he reacts with, obviously, with distress, but it just isn't good. I mean, that would be hard. What could be worse than that?
yeah.
Right under his eyes, his daughter and his wife. It really couldn't be much worse than that.
Well, and it's terrible because at that point, like you couldn't call a doctor. He's like, do not call the doctor, because if
Mm-mm.
you call the doctor, they're going to report it and then they'll take her away. We won't be able to bury her the way we would normally, which is understandable. Like living in this post-COVID, well, not post, but like it's still COVID world now, right?
Right. Post-pandemic, I guess.
Post,
So
yeah,
knock on wood. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Living in it now, and like if it had gotten so bad, like I could see that the government would be like, we need to collect the dead and get rid of you. You could see a world in which that could happen.
Right.
Before COVID, I was like, oh, that's silly, whatever. But like now, like I'm like,
I
oh
know.
shit, that's
That's the
totally
that's
possible.
like the crazies, the Romero crazies, or
Crazies,
I mean
yes.
that's the scenario. The solution from the government is worse than the actual plague, in a sense.
But then you see that he wanted, so there's that scene where he finds his daughter, he comes home and he told his wife not to call the doctor, but of course, like we find out that you go blind before
Yeah, yeah.
you die. The timing of when you go blind and when you die is a little bit suspect, because the wife
Mm.
dies, says I'm blind, and then kills over, whereas the
Right,
daughter
right
took
away.
a day or so. So it's like, okay, whatever. But so we find out that she calls the doctor, and I don't blame her, because that's terrible. You want to help your child. She ends up calling the doctor, and they come and take her body, and they dump it into this huge fire. Looks like the tire fire in Springfield. And he tries to go get that body because he wants to bury it, get his child's body. And you see all these other family members there at this
Mm.
pit, trying to like rush the police to kind of to
Yeah,
get
you're
their
right.
family's body. And that was really affecting it. At one point, one of the soldiers was like, get out of here, have to leave. And he's like, and um, what's Vincent Price's name in here? I keep forgetting.
Robert Morgan, was he Morgan in
Morgan,
this?
yeah, Morgan.
Yeah, yeah.
Morgan's like, oh, my child's in there. He's like, Mister, a lot of people's children are in there, including my own. We're like, holy shit.
That was effective. Yeah, that was very good. You're
Yeah.
right. More of that would have been, just sort of this sense of terror. I mean, right. That was very good. Yeah.
So back to the beginning, we do see that he has like a kind of a shot glass set up in the living room where he's making the stakes, the wooden stakes. And then he gets into the car and he kind of loads up the dead bodies that are in front of his house. And it's funny that you'll see that Vincent Price demanded to use real life people as opposed to dummies. So when he's picking those people up, they're real life, they're humans. And because he's like, he didn't want it to appear like he was picking up
dolls or
something like
something.
but later on, when he's tossing them into the pit, those are dolls.
Yeah, yeah. I was wondering about that actually,
Yeah.
but
So
that's it.
he steps in the car and he says, or he thinks that he's out of gas. But I was like, with all the preparing he does, I wouldn't think he would leave his car without gas, because that's very important for his survival to be able to leave quickly.
Yeah, yeah. Especially after 3 years. I mean, that's something where you think, because he does come across, the character is Robert Moore. He's very meticulous, like you just said.
Exactly.
That's the kind of thing he probably wouldn't. Now, in the book, there was a scene where he's doing something and his watch stops, which could have, and he had forgotten to wind his watch. And he realizes it's later than, and he's far from his house. It's later than it should be for him to race back home and get in before dark. That was plausible. I mean, someone you wind your watch every day. One day he forgets and now the watch, and it says 4 o'clock, and he realizes it's actually like 7 o'clock, whatever.
Yeah.
But it's something like this. I agree. I mean, he would probably do in his sleep.
Yeah. So then he goes to this supermarket, and in the back of it, he's got the generator running to keep the freezer going. And then we see that this is where he's getting his fresh garlic from. Although I don't, quote unquote, fresh garlic after 3 years.
I know. I don't know if you could I get fresh garlic. I love fresh, and it starts to get moldy
very quickly
after a little while.
I use garlic all the time. But
right.
I think maybe it's dried because there's also huge slabs of beef. And so maybe it's going through a drying process. I don't know, but I was curious about that.
We had to suspend disbelief a little bit there, I guess. Yeah, that was a little right. Yeah.
And then before when he was looking at the grid, he was talking about he had like he goes to the city and he tries to find people to kill them, kill these vampires, which is a plot point that's gonna come back later. He says he's like killed 8 people in like 3 years, basically saying he hasn't found that many people. But then we kind of see this montage of him killing multiple people in one day. So it's like, well, he's just having a record day.
Yeah, right.
That's what it is. But I appreciate us getting to see him killing all these people.
Right. You see him at his peak killing day.
Yeah. So then he goes back home, and this is where we kind of see the ghouls hanging out outside of his house. They can use they're very weak. They can use weapons, very reminiscent of Night of the Living Dead, which we've talked about. And they're just kind of moaning and like banging, and like one of them is calling his name, like Morgan, and then he's got the big band music going to kind of drown it out. And to me, it sounded like hell. It's like we were talking about earlier, just to be in that situation is untenable, I think. And this is in the morning, you can see this is one of the times where they kind of do allow us into like his thought process. You can see it on his face. It's like he's cracking. He's gonna get sloppy because he's cracking, and then he actually does. The next day, he goes to a mausoleum to visit a loved one. we assumed it's a loved one. And yeah, he talks to about his wife, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But we find out later that he wasn't. He I guess he didn't, when his wife got sick, he didn't call the doctor, so they didn't come to pick her up, and he was able to bury her. And then
He
later on
got
that night,
she
very
came back.
creepily, she's like,
Yeah,
let me in,
that was a
which
good scene. That was
very
yeah,
good scene, very creepy.
yeah,
um
yeah.
and so I guess maybe here, I forget the resolution of that scene specifically with her, but he kills her maybe and places her in this mausoleum. So he's
He
do you
right.
remember? Yeah, so he goes to the mausoleum to visit her, and then he falls asleep. So where in the novel you're saying he just forgets to wind his watch, in this one he falls asleep. It's very, very
Hmm.
sloppy, which I guess we're starting to see. So he forgot to fill up the car with gas. So that's one part of him being sloppy. Then he's not
So
sleeping very
maybe
well.
he's cracking at that, but right. That's
Exactly. Yeah. So
yeah.
yeah. Okay. I'm
No,
giving it
that's
to him.
sort of that could be plausible in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I mean, 3 years of constant vigilance and one or two sloppy moments, and you're at great risk. So that's possible.
Yeah.
That's true. You know, when you see something else that's kind of sloppy, maybe he's starting to become a little more, constant stress.
Yeah. and
Um,
and so he's like, oh shit, like the sun has already started to set, he needs to get home very quickly. um when he gets out of the mausoleum, he sees that there's people already around his car, so he's got to like fight him off, and it's very silly fighting, just like
yeah,
basically
the
pushing
fighting
them
doesn't work in
over.
the movie at all. You're
But
right.
it's exactly what they do in Night of the Living Dead as well, right?
Yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah, they
It's
don't
really
have
silly.
the.
But he makes it back home, he's able to fight his way back into his house. And then here we kind of get that precursor to the Thriller laugh, because he's sitting, he's like he started watching something on an old 8mm or whatever. Is basically like the 1960s version of America's Funniest Home Videos sort of thing. And like he's doing that laugh, and I was like, I'm very impressed that he's still wearing clothes, because at this point, if it were me, there'd be no clothes anywhere, and there'd be skid marks on every surface of that house. I'm just being truthful. Like, just the fact that he's wearing clothes.
One thing they could probably make, maybe make clear, like in the book, when he runs across Ruth, for example, he makes it very clear that he hasn't shaved in a long time. He's sort of he does dress and stuff, but he's gotten the hell of himself in terms of his, to some extent in terms of his hygiene appearance. So when he first appears, she's terrified of him. She's just as scared because she wasn't expecting to see a human, supposedly. There's
Yeah,
a twist there. But he's genuinely creepy because he's a big guy and he's all unshaved and he looks like this sort of, half beast himself. Um, and here they should have in the movie gone one way or the other with more clarity. Either do it kind of like they did in the other two versions, where he really takes pains to dress and bathe himself, and they mention that. So then you take it as the person is taking us. This is like his way of maintaining order in the face of chaos, like Charlton Heston or Will Smith working out. In the Omega Man, there's actually a scene where Charlton Heston gets all sweaty doing stuff there, and then he's all right. Let me get cleaned up, and he gets the next they cut, and he's clearly like taking a shower or something or a bath. He's put on fancy clothes and he sits down to play chess against this imaginary, the statue, and he has some drink. So there you take it as this is his way of maintaining sanity and order in the midst of chaos, because there's no reason to do it otherwise. That
yeah,
makes sense. Or he should go to, or he would go, maybe someone would go to hell with themselves completely, because why not? And this doesn't make it clear one way or the other, like which way he's going. Vincent Price never has a beard and looks total. He's a little unkempt, like you said here, but it's not convincing. Maybe they should have that would have been shocking to see him like with a ragged beard, and that
you
would have
know,
been unsettling, and it probably would have been very effective.
it's so funny. At one point in the movie, he's like kind of like collecting himself a little bit, and then he goes and feels his face, and he's like, oh, there's a little bit of growth here, and then that's it. That's all we get. It's not visible to us at all. He doesn't have a 5 o'clock shadow at
Right.
all. But
Right.
that's what we take is, oh man, this guy has completely let himself go. That's
He's
as
completely let
far as we're
himself. He
gonna
missed.
go with Vincent Price.
Right. He's got 2 days. You're a day and a half without shaving. He's losing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
So then we do get this flashback, and we're kind of seeing what happened to leading up to this point. We see his wife and daughter. They're at a birthday party, and then we do see
The main vampire is an old acquaintance or friend, colleague actually of his, right in the
exactly.
flashback. So that's why he's calling Morgan's name. They knew each other and they worked together in real life. He went to work together and stuff.
Yeah.
So that's why he's just calling him, Morgan.
And then so we get the part about the airborne virus. There's like an article in the newspaper that they're seeing, and the wife is asking, do you think it's true? Whatever. He doesn't believe it. And then next day or a couple days, next scene, the daughter is now sick, and they have those like old time like mosquito nets around her, and so she's getting sick as well. And then
Right.
the wife is sick. She tries to get out of bed. And he's like, no, don't get out of bed. But she's like, no, I want to make breakfast. He's like, okay. He didn't try too hard to stop his sick
No,
wife from making
that's another
breakfast.
thing from making him break. That's one thing. Yeah, absolutely. That dawned on me watching the movie too. It's like, Jesus Christ, yeah, you make some eggs for yourself or something. It's not that terrible. But also, like when his daughter was, and that it was affecting, of course. His daughter says, "Mommy, I can't see. I'm
Yeah.
blind," and the mother is, distraught, which is the way it should be, what you would expect. And he does seem upset, and he does make the point. You understand why he says, don't call the doctor, because then, like you just said, the military will come, whatever. But he sort of is like, don't call the military, don't call a doctor. He does say that pretty urgently. That becomes clear. But I don't know what else he would do, but to me, he seemed like he just went off to work then kind of blithely. I mean, his own daughter,
Yes.
little girl, is blind, and that's terrible. I mean, what could be, take a sick day, stay there just to comfort your daughter. Is it really that important to get to work? You can't call a doctor, so all you can do is sit there. I can't imagine going to work if my kid just went blind, and even under those conditions, I'd be like, you know what? This is absolutely horrible. I'm going to sit here and hold her hand. I'm going to talk to her. I'm going to do, and he just don't call a doctor. I'm going to work. Huh?
Yeah, and they try to explain it because he is a biologist or a scientist
Right.
trying to
No.
search for a cure. But even then, I'm like, fuck that. Like,
Even then, he had,
what
yeah.
what is so funny is like he's like trying to assuage his wife and be like, yeah, we're at the lab and we're working on it. Then when he gets to the lab, he's like, there's two people working on the virus theory. That's what the
Right.
head of the lab is like. I'm like, two people? You have two people working on the virus theory? Shouldn't all your resources be working on this? What are you
Yeah.
talking about? Are there other things more pressing than trying to
Right.
find a cure for the common cold or something right now? I think we
Right.
all hands need to be on deck right now.
Right. No, that aspect. Even in a low budget movie, they could have just had a line where it's like someone leaves the office and comes back and says to him, like, everyone's working like crazy. It's just met with trying. They don't have to show all these people if they don't have the budget. That's fine. But they don't give any indication. They say like two people, like, working
Yeah.
on, we'll get to it. We have a couple of people working on it.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the world may end, but,
And so that's where we see that Ben works there with him, and Ben thinks it's vampires, but Morgan obviously thinks that he's being crazy. But like you were saying, there with the scientific approach to vampirism, that's kind of see what we're doing here. That's really interesting. I like when they do that. And we'll see that in other like later vampire movies like Blade and other movies like
right.
that.
Yeah.
So again, then we get he's at home and he's watching TV, and there's updates from the government on the TV telling you to burn bodies and stuff like that. Again, another thing that seems very familiar to Night of the Living Dead. So you're kind of seeing where like Romero like picked and chose what he
Right.
needed for his movie.
It's an even though it's not a great movie, it's true. It's a surprisingly influential movie. A lot of things that are developed more in more detail and more effectively in later movies like Night of the Living Dead, and then going from that, are in this movie. It's sort of like an embryonic version of what was developed better, later, but it does have a lot of that, right? Watching, you're cut off from the world, you're getting stuff through TV, the world's going to hell. It is a lot of that is in here,
Yeah.
not done in the most dramatic way, but it's here.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a really good point.
So this is when we find out that, he tells his wife not to call the doctor because they report it. Uh, and the little girl, his little girl, saying that she's blind, and like just the look on her face was terrifying to me. Like it was,
Yeah,
that was affecting. So like we were talking about, there are scenes in this movie. It has brief moments of being really affecting and really,
right.
really, really great. But it just, I don't, doesn't stay that way the whole time. There's
It doesn't
peaks and
say that
valleys.
it has peaks and valleys, right? No,
Yeah.
it just doesn't gel in that sense. They don't overdo it either with the daughter. To make that, it doesn't become suddenly overly pathetic. It doesn't become overly sad. It's very real. This is very terrifying, but it has its moments, and then it sort of goes back to, let me go to the lab, and there were two people in the lab working on it. Like after this very effective scene with his daughter,
Yeah.
So.
And then so we do see now scenes of like the army moving in, so you could tell like it's getting worse and worse. That it's kind of like taking over the world. Then his last day, he goes to the lab, and it's just him and the main professor, and he's like, "Mankind won't be destroyed. The fact that you and I are here is evidence of that." But really, he could hardly finish the sentence with a straight face. Like he didn't believe it himself, you
Right.
know.
Yeah.
So I thought that was pretty good. So then he goes home. The army's taking his daughter. This is where he tries to go to that burn pit to get her body back, but he can't. Then he goes back home, and his wife yells out, "Bob, I can't see." And then he runs to her, and she's dead immediately. So
All right.
again, the
It affects
timing.
adults faster than
Yeah,
children, I
yeah,
guess.
apparently. So and then later, so he takes her body to bury it, and then later in the night, we hit that "Let Me In" sound. It's so fucking creepy, really good.
That was good. Yeah.
And then we see her. He lets her in, and we see her. Verge is her name. And
Right.
tell me that that's not a zombie from Night of the Living Dead. If you take a
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
from that to that,
Yeah.
it looks really, really similar. And I am not. I love Night of the Living Dead. In fact, I'm doing it in
Oh yeah.
a week or so. And I love George Romero. I'm not saying anything. Art is imitation is art. Art is imitation, right? So there's no problem with it. I like to see the genesis of because
Oh,
where
I
shit comes from.
totally agree. I mean, that's all art, and certainly in genres, it's a particularly strong. Somebody does something, and then another director sees builds on that. And if Romero saw, I don't know if he probably read the Matheson thing, but if he saw this movie and he got somebody, he completely took it to a new direction with much higher intensity. Pretty much a perfect horror movie. Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, how many? I don't know about you. I've had so many arguments over the years. Less now because he's established. With Brian De Palma. He's ripping off. He's not ripping off Hitchcock. He's taking what he's one of my favorite directors. It's not a matter of he's ripping off. Clearly, he was influenced. He says that himself. Obviously, he loves
Yeah.
Hitchcock and other directors, but he does his own thing with. He takes things. That's art,
Well,
and
there
it's
were some
definitely horror
shot
movies and
by
genre.
there were some
Yeah,
shot by
sometimes.
shot. Yeah.
No, well,
Like he
what's the
does
one
with
that he took
Hitchcock.
the one with about the twin doc, with the twins.
Yeah.
He ripped off Tenebrae, that last shot completely.
Yeah.
With John Lithgow, he bends down and there's the guy. That was directly from Tenebrae, the last shot in Tenebrae. No, he's done stuff like that,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. But that's right. That's art. And certainly in genre,
And
But I know, yeah.
we don't have to get into it, but I feel that the same argument is done with Quentin Tarantino. And Quentin Tarantino, he's a bit like he will take full plot points.
He will take
And,
no,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. But he sort of mixes them up and jumbles them in his own way. But
Yeah.
right. The more you know watching a Tarantino, the more you're going to enjoy it, or be angry by it, because some people can't stand
Yeah.
that. But
The,
one or the other. This is for here's Breathless. Here's the Scorsese, the needle in the heart. He pumped the needle to get the guy out of heroin. Here's this. He takes stuff directly, but
yeah. I think that what I appreciate about Quentin Tarantino the most, his movies are, for me, a bit frustrating. Obviously, he's a great director. Can't take
Yeah,
anything
yeah.
away from him, and he shoots it well, and they're interesting. It's hard for me to get past a lot of the borrowing and stuff like that. But what what I appreciated most is his love and bringing attention to older movies
Oh
and
yeah, yeah. It's great for
movies,
them.
international movies, right? I love that. Like, so I'll come across a movie that I had never heard of, and I'll watch it, I'll love it, and I'll look it up, and I'm like, oh yeah, Quentin Tarantino has been championing this movie for decades. It's like,
I know.
oh,
I
okay,
know.
fine, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, this isn't a Tarantino cast. So then we're back to the movie Last Man on Earth. He has he's come back out of the flashback, and it's that night where he barely made it home, and he had to leave his car outside, and they have fucked up this car.
They told us great. Yeah.
It's amazing. At one point, you see a vampire taking the bench seat out of the back of the car. It's like, come on, like that's petty as fuck. Why?
I
What?
know. I know.
There's no need to do that.
That was frustration. They can't get him, so they screwed up. They fucked up his car. That's displacement.
Yeah, that's like if you would scratch somebody's car with a key when back in the day.
I know.
I
I
don't.
know.
I did that once, and I still feel terrible about that. But like that was a thing back. I haven't thought about that in decades. But like keying somebody's car,
Yeah, no, you're right.
you know,
I never
I
thought
don't
of
know if
that
people
either.
still do it, but all right. So then he's like they think Ben thinks that he can hinder me or whatever by fuck with my car, but like you were saying earlier, he just went out and got a new car,
You're just
which is
right. That's the fun part.
yeah,
Wait, right.
yeah,
Let's go to the car dealership, make sure it runs, pick up a new car.
yeah.
Who wouldn't like to do that?
So then this is where we see that puppy or the little dog
Right.
puppy for the first time.
Yeah. Well, that was well, they needed to condense it. In the book, he finds that it sort of has a little bit of a run and hide little courtship with the dog is
Yeah,
as skittish of him as he would be of the vampire. The dog is a shock to see and is not trusting, and he's wondering like, how did this dog survive? Where is it hiding? Finally, he does get the dog inside, and he goes through the process of earning its trust. But they have to condense that for time. That's fine.
yeah,
My thing there was it was pretty effective, but again, I mean, just repeating, it's just kind of the same. He just didn't show that. I would be you would think a person would be ecstatic, which he kind of is in the book. The hope
yeah.
that because next to a human, probably what would be the next best companion if you have
A
no one
dog,
would
yeah,
be a
of
dog.
course.
Even I'm a cat person more than but in that scenario, I'd rather have a dog because they're more interactive and everything.
I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes they're better than humans, so that's fine
No,
too.
absolutely. Yeah. A lot of the time. No, I know. I was just gonna say it's interesting. Like in the Will Smith version, they started out with him having the dog. So that was an interesting twist.
Okay.
And he has a pet dog, and that's how they get around. I think the sort of internal the narration, the voice, because he talks to his dog. It's a little bit
Yeah.
like his boy, actually. When you think about it, the Don Johnson movie from the Harlan Ellison story. But the dog, I don't know if you remember, there was no dog in the Omega Man, but in the third one, they make the dog a main character, and then he spoiler alert, he winds up losing the dog, and it's pretty heartbreaking.
Yeah,
Because
that's a really
he
effective
had
scene.
this dog for apparently 3 years. He was the family dog when the Earth was the Earth. Here, a little bit more could have been done to in the Last Man to wring emotion from that. I think his connection with the dog. It was a little bit too fast, I thought.
Oh yeah, because he only had it for like a day and then ended up passing away.
Right. It could have been. Yeah.
The way he reacts to the dog, are we to assume that all living things died, or because does he not see like deer? I feel like deer would take over. Like we see that in
Yeah, no, that's a
I
good
Am
point. I
Legend.
wondered about that in the book also. It's
Yeah,
not really made clear. Right, they did have that note, which I thought was
yeah,
more, which was cool to see him in New York City and stuff.
yeah,
It adds to the weirdness. It's never really even made clear, and I guess the implication has to be that all living things, or certainly mammals, I don't know, died,
yeah,
because the book also has no other signs of animal life at all, not just mammals or domestic animals. No zoo animals are running around. No, just thinking of it, there's no birds. There's no rats. Can we get a plague to kill off just the rats? They don't. There's nothing. That's a little strange, and there's really no. You have to somehow assume that virtually all living things died.
Yeah.
But it's never made clear from the book or in any of the movies, like what exactly. This was one tough fucking dog. I don't know how this dog's.
Yeah. So then he comes across the dog. He chases him for a while. Doesn't find him, but he does come across um, some bodies that had been staked with metal
With
stakes
metal, right?
as opposed to wooden ones, which he uses. So he's like, well, there's somebody still alive. Then
Mm.
he goes back home. The puppy's there. The puppy's injured. He kind of cleans him up again, but he realizes, takes his blood and realizes that he's infected as well. And he ends up burying the puppy. And I was like, oh shit, just like with the wife, is he
She
gonna
gonna come. Then
bury
it'll be
it? Is
like
he
Pet
gonna go back?
Cemetery. This dog's
Yes,
gonna
then
come
it's Pet
back.
Cemetery. And then we'll have a vampire dog, but the fucking cowards did not do it.
I
They
know that would have
they,
been great. That would have been good.
they
I
showed
was thinking
him
that also.
with a metal stake or wooden stake between having been staked by him. So he buried him
Yeah,
like that, which I was like, fuck, man. But I'm
I
sure
know.
that's a different movie, but I was kind of excited about it.
I know.
So then this is where he finally comes across
Ruth, right?
Ruth, right? He comes across Ruth.
Mm.
He sees a woman and like runs to her like an idiot, right? Because and she obviously, so she's scared because we think because it's another human, but you actually said something that she is actually scared because why? Why? What's the other?
In the book, well, he was all unshaven and just unkempt, and he looked, kind of like a savage himself. So he was a scary figure. Like, who's this guy? There's a twist to that in the story. I mean, if you want me to say, I mean, it turns out,
Yeah,
as
go
I
ahead.
think they even have here in the movie, it turns out she was sent to spy on him by the people who are actually living. They're not vampires, but they're infected. So they've been infected with the germ, with the virus, whatever, but they have learned the bacteria has mutated and they're surviving. And that's like the big twist, the big sort of revelation in the last part of the book, and so even in the movie. But you get the sense that she's sort of like pretends to be scared, but she's genuinely kind of, scared. He thinks actually it's from his point of view, so he thinks she's scared in part because he looks like he's unshaven, but in the book, and they mention that here in the movie. But I think again, somehow the timing, it's like it's an imperceptible thing. What sometimes makes a movie really work and something that doesn't quite work is in the book. Um, he finally seems to win her trust. She comes into the house, and they have this. They start to communicate. He's also trying to repress his sexual desires. Even if they don't have that in the movie, that's fine. But it does add a naturalistic touch, and it's not unseemly either. I mean, it really seems very natural. I mean, it really does. It's not like he's ogling her. I mean, that's
Well,
what a person would be like, male or female.
do
Probably.
you remember in Old Boy they do it? They do this as well. In Old Boy, the first time he sees a woman, he's in the elevator and he's just like up against the
Oh,
elevator walls, just like, I mean, like it's so understandable,
yeah,
you know.
it's a bit
Now,
overwhelming after all that time, right?
yeah, but you were talking about the timing a bit.
In the book, the sort of timing between when she comes to the house, and he's kind of, they have this sort of, court, sort of tense courtship. He wants to win her trust. She seems to be rejecting it, and then she sort of slowly comes around, and then she reveals that she's kind of like a double agent, but she also, it becomes clear, has kind of become not so much attracted to, but she likes him, and she realizes he's desperate, lonely, because the group she's representing, the humans who have been infected but are still alive, they were scared of him. Now that she's seen him, he's become humanized, and so there's all these different things going on, which might be a little easier to do in a story. That's true.
Yeah,
But here it's just kind of flat. They don't capture much of the complexity there. He
right.
sort of brings her in kind of quickly, and the movie's only 86 minutes or whatever. And I know it was a low budget film, but if they'd given a little more time for that to breathe and develop the suspense in that segment, in that sequence, is she a spy? Because he doesn't trust her fully. Is she infected? Is she not infected? All that's going through his mind. They don't develop that quite enough. That could have been another few minutes longer, and I think the audience would have totally followed it. And you'd have a 90
100%.
minute,
Yeah.
yeah. and you'd have a 90-minute movie, which isn't a long movie, or 91-minute, instead of an 86-minute movie, it wouldn't have been overlong. It would have worked a little bit. I think that's part of the issue there, part of the problem that keeps it from being quite as strong as it could have been. Because that's a great part. There's a lot of tension there between them.
I agree. I agree completely. Like when we find out in the book, specifically in the book, and then in the Will Smith book as well, or Will Smith movie as well, when we find out what the title "I Am Legend" means, that should like stop you in your tracks, right? That does in the book, right? But here, they don't give you time to stop and think about what she just said when she's like, you are a legend to them, just like vampires were a legend to you. Like, that's what you are now. That is an amazing concept, but the movie doesn't give a chance to breathe at all. It just go once they start attacking him, the house, and it's just a chase, and it's one thing after another, and then the movie ends, you know. And I think that, like you were saying, really affected the audience kind of caring and feeling and the connecting with the movie.
Right. No, I completely agree. The book and the Will Smith version does do that very, very well. Where just when he's not sure whether he can trust her and so on, and just when he feels he can trust her, and then she reveals she's actually a spy, but she has feelings for him. There's a lot going on there, and you really feel the emotion, because he could have just reacted with suspicion and fear and killed her or something. And right, they just sometimes, generally speaking, like you argue a movie or something is overlong, it could have cut here. But sometimes, every now and then, you get a movie where it's the opposite. They should have let it expand. They should have expanded it. It doesn't happen that often. Usually, things like they could have shortened, condensed. It was 2 hours and 10 minutes. It could have been 2 hours. That's the more common reaction. But this was an example of the opposite, where they have great material, and sometimes you got to develop things and let it go. And they just didn't do it. That's got to be one of the reasons Matheson was sort of like, they sort of followed they followed the arrows of where the novel goes, but they didn't quite get it. They just didn't quite get it right.
Yeah.
Don't go directly to go. Stop a bit. Take a walk until you get to go. Just take a stroll.
Yeah. All right. So back to the movie. She does come into the house. She does see her reflection in the mirror without going crazy. So that's something that we find out is they do see the reflection. They just don't want to see it. It hurts them to see the reflection. But she's able to see hers. And then she offers up her story immediately, which is kind of sus, because she's like, this is why I'm here, and this and this. And it's like, And then so that kind of makes him second guess himself. And it's kind of like attacks her with the garlic, and she reacts poorly. He's like, you are infected. And she's like, no, it's just I have a sensitive stomach my whole life, and you shoved a fucking bunch of garlic in my face. But he's like, okay, he buys it a little bit, but then later on he makes dinner and she's not eating. At this point, you're like, something else is happening. And so they're kind of talking, and he's offering up an idea of why he is immune. And this is the most ridiculous thing. And I was going to ask you if they have this in the novel, because I read the novel, but it's been a while. He says he was bitten in his sleep by a bat when he was in Panama, and he believes that the bat had the weakened form of the vampire virus, which then was his immunity, which was basically a vaccine for him and caused him immunity. Absolutely fucking ridiculous. But I mean, so in this world, vampirism is specifically derived from bats, which is so ridiculous. Is that in the novel?
I know. Believe it or not, that is
okay. That's cool.
Believe it or not, that is in the novel. Yeah, I think of the movies, the Omega Man probably captured, the most plausible reason. Remember, they're developing a experimental vaccine, and Charlton Heston is in a helicopter to bring this vaccine somewhere. and it crashes. The plague is fully underway, and he survives the crash and he crawls over. Yeah, it's dramatic. And he injects himself with the experimental vaccine. And it turns out that it makes him immune. It was a vaccine that was going to work, but it's too late because the damage around the world is done and so on. That was more plausible. Like, he would have gotten sick and died too if he didn't give himself this vaccine. So science basically came up with something too little, too late, but it worked for him. So he's immune. But yeah, that ridiculous, that did kind of stick out of the book too. Unless he's just trying to come up with something. I mean, to Vincent Price's character's credit, Robert Moore, he does sort of say that's the best explanation I can come up with, or something like that. I mean, it doesn't sound very, plausible.
So later on, he kind of bursts in on her, injecting herself with something, and then he's like, "Okay, what the fuck was that?" And so she tells him that. He's like, "Is that a vaccine?" He's like, "Yeah, we've had it for some time." And she's like, her and her people are going to start a new society, and they're going to start it without him, basically, because this is where it's like he's a legend to them. I was like, okay, this is where it is. And then she tells him that they're infected, like you're saying, but they're alive, and they're using this vaccine to keep from turning into the vampires that we see, like with Ben, but he didn't know that. And when he was going on these excursions during the day, he was killing her people, which were humans that haven't turned, as opposed to vampires, and he didn't realize that. And so that's why he's a kind of a legend to them now. And this was the part where he was kind of overacting a bit, because he was like kind of frustrated. Like he's like, "Oh, do you think me a fool or something like that?" Because he's been searching for the cure, and they've had the cure for years or however long, But this acting at this point for Vincent Price was a bit. I was like, not the best, but understandable.
No, I agree. See, the thing is too, in the book, she makes it clear that she's kind of sympathetic to him now that she's met him and he's become humanized in her eyes. She tells him that she basically goes back to her people, the infected people, and in the book it makes it clear, like he's like, I can't believe I didn't think of this, but they're surviving because bacteria mutates, which it does, obviously. So they have a different version, like COVID. And really, it's like, that's why post-COVID it has a real resonance. But so that's why they're able to live in this sort of this human. They're alive, they're human, but they're infected. They're not vampires because the bacteria mutated. But she tells him, I'm going to go back to them, but at some point, they're going to come to kill you because you are legend. They just cannot go on, that you're around. So she tells him, it won't be immediately. I'll put it off, try to delay and stuff. But at some point, they're going to come, and he should go escape into the mountains and continue his life because they're going to come to kill him. And then is the end of a chapter, and the last chapter is like 3 months later, and he hasn't left, and they come to get him. So it makes it clear, like he sort of made the choice. It's sort of like a passive suicide almost. They do come to get him, and they do kill him. And his last thought is like, I am legend. But that's a very interesting, ending. It really is. He could have escaped. Then he would have been even more isolated, I guess, because he did have his comforts, at least in his house. But he chose not to. And here it sort of has a much more conventional kind of, dramatic, like you say, it just becomes a chase. But all that sort of psychological complexity, and which they still could have done on film.
Because this was 64, right? So at this point, he tells her to look in the mirror, and she reacts like she was repelled by it. But so I guess that she hasn't taken her medication, so she's turning at this point. So she passes out, and he does a transfusion on her, which works to cure her, which I don't know if he's now damned her, because this whole society is set up on being infected, but having to take your medication, sort of thing. So I don't know what he's done there. And I don't even know why he kind of did it, but she's cured. But then all of a sudden Ben figures out how to turn a knob, or something. Like he didn't lock the door. Again,
Right.
he's just getting sloppy. And so Ben is able to just walk in and he attacks Ruth. And then that's when the whole civilian militia shows up, and this is when the chase ensues. And he goes to the armory, and he gets these little magic smoke bombs, like he was a magician or something. Like, what was he hoping with those? What was he hoping to do with those? I don't understand it.
Mm. No, me either. That's what
Yeah,
it just became a little fuzzy. No, the climax it kind of peters out. You watch it's not terrible, but it becomes fuzzy, and you really needed more clarity. Like what's going on here? You just don't feel what the stakes the way I think the way you should.
nice
Maybe
pun.
that's what. Maybe that's yeah. That's unintentional. You're right. No pun intended. You really don't feel that the way you probably should for a climax of a movie like this.
Yeah,
When you think of the Will Smith one, they have a different ending, but they really built to that climax. Night of the Living Dead is one of the greatest endings ever. It's totally despairing. You feel it, in your gut. And here, just like you say, kind of then he gets the smoke bomb. How come he didn't have them in his house before? I mean, just too many things are
yeah.
sort of going on without.
So he makes it to this church, this wonderful, huge church. These steps remind me very much of that Twilight Zone episode where it's the end of the world, and there's that like no, he's not a librarian. He's a bank teller who loves to read, and then he
Oh,
finally gets a chance to read, and then his glasses break. Yeah,
that's a
again,
great one.
those are the steps remind me of that. But also, that's also kind of a Last Man on Earth sort of thing. So, and he makes it to this church, and he gets up on the pulpit or whatever, and he calls them freaks and mutations. I was like, okay, that's a bit rude. And then he gets staked, and he falls over, and he says, "I'm a man, the last man." And then he says, "They were afraid of me," and then he dies. So in this part, in the novel, he says, "I am legend," right?
Mm.
But because they didn't use "I am legend," which I think is a better name than the last man on Earth, they have to say the last man. I was like, I don't know. I don't know. It was okay. And then so then we see Ruth. She's still alive. She's there, and we see there's women and children there, which so you understand that there's a hope for a future in this world. It looks a bit different, but it's a future nonetheless.
Mm.
And then she goes up to a child and says, "Oh, if you're scared, don't be scared. We're all safe now." And it's like, wow. So he was the threat to them, you
Right.
know. And then the movie ends, and then that's the end of The Last Man on Earth. So overall, we're going to rate it in a second, but overall, what did you think of The Last Man on Earth from 1964?
It was okay. I remember not the most, detail. It like basically as we were kind of saying, it has some good moments for sure, like the child scene going blind. It has a good atmosphere. It evokes sort of this empty world. Well, but it just doesn't develop the potential of the story as well as it should. I think it had great raw material there, and it just doesn't develop. So it's sort of like the kind of thing I really don't feel like a great need to see it again. Sometimes you want to see a movie again because it was great, just it was fantastic, you loved it. Sometimes it was just more interesting. I don't even know if I really need to see that again. Sometimes a movie is by no means what you would call a great movie or even a very good movie, but it was funny, it was entertaining, it was silly. Just I really want to see that again. This is the kind of movie where I may wind up seeing it again, but I don't feel that pressing need or desire. Just saying, yeah, no, there are some movies, you watch again for any number of reasons. It could have been great, or it could have been even not great, but entertaining, or just some way that you really want to see it again, or just to fulfill something. This, is really not the kind of movie I would feel much of a desire to see again. I might see it again, but it doesn't have that feeling. Whereas there are some movies where like, I'll give it a year, 2 years, whenever. Tomorrow. I
Oh
really
yeah,
want to see that. This just doesn't quite have that feeling.
yeah. For me, it's like
that was,
there's reasons to watch this, right? If you want to see the origins of zombie movies, like Romero movies, right? Watch this. If you're a Vincent Price lover, watch this. If you're a Richard Matheson lover, watch this. Like, there's reasons to watch it. Are there reasons to rewatch? I don't know. But
right. That's saying it well. Yeah,
yeah.
definitely.
So
Yeah.
so one last thing before we go into ratings is, just like Night of the Living Dead, there was a clerical error that caused this film's copyright to expire. So it's now in the public domain, and it's been released on numerous low-budget home video editions. But the novel obviously is still under copyright. But yeah, so I find it really fascinating how both of these movies had the same thing happen to them, where they messed up the copyright and now they're in the public domain.
Very strange. I know. I should say maybe that, in terms of where to see it, like I watched it actually just on Freevee, where you get a few commercials, but you can live with it. And it is a very good print. It's letterboxed.
For me, I saw it on YouTube for free, and it was a nice cut as well, and no commercials.
Yeah.
So that was nice. So Scott,
That's
for
good.
you, what would you give The Last Man on Earth, 1964, out of 5 upside down crosses?
Out of 5 upside down crosses, which don't keep a zombie in the grave, I'd have to give it like a 3 upside down crosses. I mean, it's really like a kind of milk toast tepid, but that's it's not great. It's not terrible. So
Yeah.
I'd rank it as, and it has historical value, as you pointed out. That's true. So you can't deny that. It definitely has historical value, and horror people would be interested in it just for that reason alone. And it's a Vincent Price movie.
Yeah.
So for all those reasons, I would give it 3 upside down crosses. So it's a middling movie, but worth seeing for various reasons.
Yeah, and I gotta agree with you for everything we've said so far. It's it's a fun movie at points. It's got its peaks and its valleys, its highs and its lows, but I enjoyed it. This is probably the 4th or 5th time I watch it. I don't know why I've watched this movie so many times, but I have. And so yeah, I'm gonna give it three upside down crosses here. And then the last thing I would ask you is for a recommendation of a movie in a similar vein to The Last Man on Earth. So for me, I'm going to recommend to you the Night of the Living Dead remake from 1990 with Tony Todd in there. I think that's just a real fun movie. One of the ones that people don't like see a lot of time and don't really talk about, but I enjoy it. And it's got the Barbara in it is not just some woman who's in a coma. She's actually like fighting and is kind of a badass. So that'd be my recommendation for you. Do you have a recommendation for me?
Yes, I'm not sure whether you've seen it or not, but it's the film The Girl with All the Gifts, which is what year is that, from 2000. It's fairly recent. Just looking at it here, 2016. 2016. It's a British movie. 2017 in the United States. And it's sort of dystopian group are apparently not infected or immune, led by this little girl, happens to be black, who sort of leads them through this very dangerous journey. And it's another one where, the sort of idea that maybe bacteria will mutate and maybe humanity will live on in a different form is in there. And it's a very tense movie. And just dawned on me, it's kind of a little bit, in a sense, has a similarity to Night of the Living Dead, the original, in that even though the little girl, who's the main character, is black, she's British and black, nothing's really made of the fact about her race. I mean, she just happens to be, which kind of reminds me of, the Night of the Living Dead, where, I mean, everyone knows that story if they know the movie, that he just cast him because he was the best actor. But the fact that they don't really make any big deal of that at all or anything is one of the things that makes the movie so fascinating. And The Girl with All the Gifts kind of has a little of that, but it's a very, very tense, very, very suspenseful movie. I would highly recommend for people who want to see something similar.
Yeah,
The Last
that's
Man.
that's a lot. Yeah. That's a great movie. It's really a lot of fun. I enjoyed that one a lot. So Scott, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been a blast. We are going to continue our conversation about this movie and anything else we'd like on the Sunday School Sessions, which is a Patreon exclusive. So if you want to support the show in that way, patreon.com/myhorrorconfessional. So anybody listening wants to hear those, we have every week we have a post show on there called Sunday School Session. So Scott and I are going to continue our conversation there. But before we do that, Scott, if you could please let everybody know once again how they can follow you, how they can support you, all that sort of stuff.
Okay, sure. Just the usual Facebook, Instagram, or X, formerly known as Twitter, as Scott Adlerberg and all of them. And anyone who's looking to buy a new book that hopefully is suspenseful, scary a little bit, can pick up The Screaming Child from Max Booth's Ghoulish Books, which you can Google and order directly from him. It's also available through Amazon. But support Max, that would be better. And that's pretty much it. You can follow me in any of those places.
All right. Sounds great. Thank you once again for being on the show. I had a blast. And thank you, everybody, for listening. And we will talk to you next week.